Hello and welcome to this panel discussion. We're very excited to have some great guests join us here today. My name is Adee Burton and I'm the Chapters and Engagement Co-Director for STAND Canada, and I will be the moderator for this discussion. So a quick note about us before we get started. We are a national youth-based advocacy organization working to make ending and preventing genocide a cornerstone of Canadian foreign and domestic policy. Given our focus on genocide and in particular the attention on refugees fleeing Iraq and Syria, which is one of our focus regions, our primary campaign right now is Why Do Refugees Pay?, which advocates for the reform of Canada's immigration loan program. So the purpose of this roundtable is to build upon the conversation already taking place across advocacy and immigration organizations in Canada and the world, and illuminate some of the complexities in this very complex range of issues. We do not anticipate a resolution of the questions posed here, but rather that this roundtable contributes to the overall discussion and deepen our understanding of the issues. That being said, I would also like to make clear that the panelists who join us here are not necessarily representing their organizations, and the views expressed during this informal discussion should not be taken out of context or as official statements. So thank you very much for joining us, Sabrina and Olive. If you could go ahead and introduce yourselves. Sabrina, maybe you can go first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina Ziegler. I'm the settlement coordinator for AMSSA. And AMSSA stands for the Affiliation of Multicultural Societies and Service Agencies of BC. And we're the umbrella organization for all immigrant and refugee serving agencies in the province. And we provide capacity building opportunities and training and support to approximately 99 organizations that are funded in the province of British Columbia to provide support to newcomers to the province.
Great, thank you, Sabrina. Olive?
I'm a nurse researcher in Ontario. I actually live in Hamilton, did my PhD at University of Toronto. So first became involved in research with refugees, undocumented and asylum seekers back in the mid-90s. I belonged to a multidisciplinary team who completed a large study involving provinces of Ontario, BC, and Alberta. Actually, no, sorry, Ontario, BC, and Quebec. And we were looking at reproductive health needs of women and, the aftercare with their newborns, comparing refugees to Canadian-born women, etc. And so then my PhD built on that. And so I've done quite a bit of small study work with meeting with refugee families, women in particular with preschool children, because they are among the most vulnerable. So I've actually asked questions around transportation loans, etc. And to this day, I'm still doing those projects here in the city of Hamilton and some in Toronto and elsewhere. So that would be me. I'm teaching in global health as well as nursing, but mostly as social determinants of health, social justice and equity perspectives, mainly, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you both for joining us today and sharing your time with us. I'd like to note quickly before we jump into the questions that we encourage viewers to participate in the conversation. Please comment on the video. We will do our best to reply promptly or in real time if possible.
Okay.
So anyone can type their questions and we'll look and see what's there periodically throughout the discussion. So just to give people some background, knowing that some people are coming into this discussion with some background knowledge on the immigration loan program, which is ILP, that's the acronym we'll be using, and some people not so much. Can you please give a brief explanation of how the current ILP system works and how it affects refugee well-being? In short, how does ILP impact refugees, either positively or negatively? Anyone want to take a crack at it first?
So I think I can start maybe from a little bit the historical, and then all of you can jump in later and just talk a little bit from some of your on-the-ground experience. So the Immigration Loan Program, or ILP, the thing to think about is that it wasn't a program that was created specifically for refugees, like that's right now in the conversation. This was a program that was created in the 1950s to assist mainly European immigrants to come to Canada who needed assistance covering their travel costs. So that's kind of the historical background of how this program actually came into play. And Canada, Australia, and the United States offered these programs. And Canada currently is the only of those three that countries that have a refugee, have an immigration loan program that does charge interest. And so the current program is designed that, and it's still open for immigrants and refugees. However, it's mainly government-assisted refugees, and I think that's something that we'll talk a little bit maybe further in the conversation, is the various different categories of refugees that exist, because this is really an over-encompassing umbrella word that we're using today. But it's one where refugees, if they need assistance with their travel to Canada and or their medical screening, are able to take a loan. Maximum is $10,000, and they would have to pay this back after approximately 30 days in Canada. That's when the payback starts. Interest doesn't start until approximately the 12th month that they're here.
Great. Can you go into more of the effects on well-being? Sabrina?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were asking. So it's something that has a negative impact for refugees. So like I said, it's mainly refugees who are receiving the travel loan. Approximately of all the loans that were issued, 94% were given out to government refugees. And it's something where if they are still abroad, they're in the process of saying goodbye to maybe potentially some family members who are needing to stay in the country of origin, or they're within a very short period of time getting ready to come to Canada, are signing a lot of paperwork. And one of the things that they're also signing is these loan papers, and it causes immense stress just once they're back, realizing what they actually signed in the payback, because that's something that we'll get into, is the fact that many individuals are not even aware of the terms and conditions of the loan and how the loan will impact them moving forward. But it does impact them negatively in their settlement and integration in Canada.
Olivia or Olive, would you like to add anything to that?
Absolutely. I guess I first became aware of the travel loans back in 2001, 2002. And I was actually quite shocked that we are the only country, or we're the only country, that charged interest on these loans. The second thing that struck me at the time is we were at that point the second wealthiest nation on earth, and yet we charged interest for these loans, these very, very vulnerable populations. And so I've continued to focus on looking at income, and in my work, when I'm asking about income, because it's easy to report statistics before and after tax and all of that, but I was interested in when you've paid your housing, and your taxes, what are you left with to spend, each month on food? And so I can tell you that for these families, the first big fear is that they're going to be deported because they're too costly to the system. And I have to say, Citizenship Immigration Canada sends out collection agencies. It's very intimidating to these families. So they will do everything possible to repay that loan. The smallest portion is written off. I think it's like $700,000. By the way, for anybody who's listening and is interested, if you go to the Canadian Council for Refugees website, there is an actual button there for information on the travel loans. So what I've encountered in my studies are families that have been split because the family believed that it would be less of a financial risk to split. And for example, mother came with 3 children and dad stayed behind with 3. And the reality is the maximum loan that you can have is $10,000. Had they all come together and it was any more than that, they would have been capped at $10,000. As it was, they came separately and they were going to encounter paying more than $10,000. The other shock is how fast the repayments start, because in that first year with the Refugee Assistance Program, the big focus is on housing, getting kids into school, the health screening checks done, sorting out documentation in terms of OHIP, all of those good things. But those repayments kick in very quickly. I think it's 30 days, 30 to 90 days. And the other piece of that is that has to come out no matter what, you know, with what people are paying. And so the costs, even if you're healthy, the cost of day-to-day expenses for children, for example, over-the-counter meds, I mean, these are major things. If people have to buy a bottle of Tylenol, they're going without a meal. And they will insist on paying that debt, because most people who come here they're very proud of having arrived here. They expect to do well, but they're also expected to go and learn English language. And so, and again, on the CCR website, you'll see there the proportions of people who give up doing English language, who take these minimum wage jobs. This is not in the best interests of Canada, frankly. You know, and to send collections agencies out to government-assisted refugees, whom we are legally obligated to support and bring to Canada as part of what we signed off on the convention, you know, the protocol for refugee resettlement. And so, I mean, I've lots of different stories of that from every study that I've done over the past 10 to 15 years. It comes up. And most people won't raise it, but when I ask, that's when I'll get the stories. And it's not that people are, you know, inventing numbers. They'll actually, it's almost embarrassing. I'm not asking for the specific details, but people will set out the documentation, the checks, the statements, etc., and the letters in front of you to show you. And I think it's part of being a refugee. You're so used to producing the documentation that they continue to do that, even when I'm asking just for their word, if you will, in terms of how this is. And I know my son-in-law is from Syria. And so he's in contact with a number of recent arrivals. Some are privately sponsored, some are government assisted. And I think what we all hoped for, and I don't know, my online system here cut out a couple of times when my colleague here was speaking, unfortunately, but there were a few months back in late 2015, early 2016, when the travel loans were suspended for Syrian refugees specifically. And I think we all looked with a deal of optimism. Is this an opportunity now where this government, who has stood tall, if you will, in terms of welcoming refugees to Canada, you know, was this government actually going to reconsider travel loans and stop it altogether? And unfortunately, it's not the case. It was reinstated late spring this year. And so we have these distinctions even within the Syrian refugee community. But like right now, I know of a family with 3 kids who came an interesting route from Asia, who signed a travel loan document, minimal explanation, not too sure of the detail, but would do anything to get somewhere safe to settle. Came here, was told originally, no, travel loans, you don't have to pay that, don't worry. And then got here and then had a visit from a government official. They couldn't say which government official or from what department, who advised them that in fact they would be starting repayments and that the papers would be processed soon. So they don't know for how long, for how much, or what the terms are. And so this information gap is also a stressor at a time when people really don't need it. And they've landed here in August, so, you know, in the province of Ontario. So it continues, and I'm just shocked that, you know, the stories continue. Yeah.
So you hear repeated themes about a lack of cohesion in the program, a misalliance of objectives, and what I'd like to ask you guys next is, how do you think Canada can improve understanding the terms and conditions of the refugee loans, understanding the needs of refugees, for example, the financial cost of living in Vancouver, which is very high versus other places in Canada. How do you think Canada can improve on that? Sorry, maybe Sabrina can start again.
Sure. So there's quite a couple of things that we talked about, and so one of the things, like we both mentioned, like my colleague also mentioned, is the lack of information, or the information that's given in a very condensed short period of time to refugees when they do sign on the loan. So the situation is that they're receiving this information while they're still abroad. Depending where they are, they could be through a different embassy or visa officer from the Canadian government. They're filling out multiple papers at the same time. So they're needing to do their medical screening, their security screening. They're needing to get exit visas from where they are, depending which country they're in. So there's multiple things that they need to fill out. And so the transportation loan, they receive, that is explained about 1 to 5 minutes to them. That's the average length of time that it is, the loan is being reviewed. And the thing is, the loans are written in legalese and either in English or French. As we know, many refugees are not fluent on either of our official languages, and many also have literacy struggles in their first language as well. And so, if I just think of myself, like when I bought my apartment and I had to go through stacks of legal documents, I could barely understand it, and I wasn't under the stress of needing to resettle. If I don't sign this, what's going to happen to me? I was in a safe environment, and I'm fluent in English and able to read and comprehend, I think, pretty well. So, and for me, those terms and conditions and the understanding and the fine print was difficult to understand. So take that into consideration of that scenario and multiply that by the stress of being overseas, just not, being a survivor of potentially torture, war, being separated from your family, potentially having been in a refugee camp for a while. Adding all of these complexities together, I think that this is an area where refugees need to receive more information. At the same time, it needs to be clearly explained to them what the implications of these loans are, and also understanding, like, if you do sign or if you don't sign, what would happen.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that. I think there are a couple of important contextual pieces. The vast majority of refugees are not coming from their country of origin. They're coming from a transition country, often a refugee camp or an urban setting. These are not experiences that have any sense of permanence, although for Syrian refugees now, for example, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, some of the families have been there for 4 to 5 years. So the notion of coming to Canada for resettlement has an idea of permanence behind it, for one thing, a sense of welcome for another. And people are very optimistic about they're going to be able to get ahead, they're going to be able to work. And so the notion of payback is perhaps overestimated. But I think the other thing that's important to say is the vast majority of people coming right now from the Middle East and from Africa aren't coming from societies where loans and debt is common. People have to save and pay cash up front for most things. So it's not something that people would be necessarily familiar with, that whole process about how repayment works. And I agree with my colleague, the amount of documentation that people need to complete for every child, for every adult, the security screening, it is quite overwhelming. And the notion of the entire time that overrides that is, I might get stopped at any point. And so I think the notion of not being honorable and paying back is the furthest thing from anybody's head. I also believe there's an overestimation of, if it's thought about at all, the ability to repay. I suspect most people aren't really taking it in what it is they're signing for, other than I need to do this to get to Canada, the same as, the health and the travel documents, etc. but the consequences here are quite striking when people get here. They really are.
It's frustrating. I started learning about this just a year ago. I don't think I knew much about it at all before.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it doesn't seem to be like a policy issue or a financial issue or a political issue. It seems bureaucratic, that these are bureaucratic failures
Well,
of,
yes.
of
Yeah.
administration, so keeping that in mind, I guess, we want to look a little bit more at the factors that contribute to refugees struggling to repay the loan and make interest payments in particular. Can you share any stories or case studies that you think illuminate some important point that you'd like to share? Maybe Olive can start.
Sure. Certainly for me, the thing that strikes me is people's shock at the cost of things like utilities, rent, you know, the money, the Refugee Assistance Program allowance. And I mean, many of the young dads, young mums have said that to me. It looked like a lot of money. And then they quickly get out there and they realize the cost of a bag of rice, a bag of sugar, the basic staples. Next thing, your child is going to school, and all of a sudden, you know, there are additional materials that you need to buy for your child to be at school, never mind the trips and all the rest of it. I can speak as somebody who came here as an immigrant. It's quite a shock. I came here in November, and the cost of winter clothing for your children, the coats, the boots, this isn't anything like the clothing that most refugees come understanding. And once you times that for the number of children that a lot of families have, that's quite significant. And yet you still got to put food on the table. And so people end up taking minimum wage jobs. I've heard of many families where the parents work back to back, and they might have a neighbor help mind the kids if they can. And so often the parents are working between them 3 jobs to just get by. And this is even before the Refugee Assistance Program ends, because that's not a whole lot of money there. I think things like the child tax benefit increase has been really a big boost and a help for many families with young children. I think more of the same. In the grand scheme of things, the travel loan for the entire country is less than $13 million. We spend quite a bit of time on collection, quite a bit of money on collection agencies. I think the figure on the CCR website was around $900,000, and we write off just over $500,000 of bad debt out of 13 million, less than 13 million each year. That shows you that the vast majority of people do whatever it takes to pay back. And I just worry about the circumstances that people are working in, because you hear about under the table work and the double work thing, the lack of attention to their own safety and well-being. It's very concerning. And it's very concerning what it does to young families, or families with young children, because the other overlay is parents are very aware of, because it's one of the first things they learn here from the networks within the refugee communities or newcomer communities, that there's a different level of scrutiny here for parents of young children than perhaps is happening overseas. So there's that pressure also to be seen and to have people understand that you're doing your best for your kids. You're ensuring that they're well nourished. You're ensuring they get to school. And it's, you know, it's quite challenging. And I mean, I've seen people in tears. They hadn't anticipated much of this at all. And at the same time, I don't want to pretend that it's all doom and gloom, because it's not. These are very resilient families. When they get, one of the best things that Canada did in terms of refugee resettlement, I think, was when they started to bring people in as groups. Because I was struck with how many times people recognized someone from the same country or from the same camp, didn't know them, but the fact that you'd seen them even a few times seemed to help. And so what I've seen is communities getting together, and they'll cook meals together. They'll share resources, pool resources, and share the ability to mind each other's kids. And that's how these families, many of them, are getting ahead, if you will, or getting on their feet. But this alone is just, I think, just an utter despairing waste of time. It's an additional burden on the most vulnerable community among all newcomers, a community that we have basically taken all sorts of accolades for on the global stage. I was in Jordan when the announcement came last year from our federal government that we would take in 25,000 refugees. I have to say that made Canada look so phenomenally great on that international stage, because I was there meeting with UNHCR people that I know, people who work with refugees in the country, and we looked great. And I have to say, not a single one of them understood anything about, it was never any talk about refugee, resettlement loans, travel loans, ever. And, you just sort of think, it's just so bad, that we're that committed and yet we fall on that sword, if you will, about travel loans. It's awful, Anyway, sorry, I think I've gone on quite a bit,
No, that's very useful. Thank you. Sabrina, would you like to jump in? Olive, I'm just going to mute you for noise reduction. So, yeah.
Sure. So there's a lot of really good nuggets that my colleague was talking about, and so paying back the loan, particularly in their first year while they're still under the Resettlement Assistance Program, and this is the program specifically for government-assisted refugees, or GARs, as they're called. This is a program where government-assisted refugees, when they come to Canada, they receive a resettlement assistance. And so this is where they come to a welcome house where they receive, here in Vancouver, for example, they'd come to Vancouver, there's a welcome house, which is ISS of BC, which is a lovely new welcome house that opened earlier in the year. And so they receive various different means of support within a short period of time. They get set up with banking, they get set up with medical dental support when needed. They receive help looking for housing, getting the kids into school, making sure that they have necessities like food and furniture and clothing. But these are all part of the program that they receive, and they do receive specific funding for this. However, from the very specific funding that they receive for these things, that's when, after the 30 days, they start needing to pay back the loan. What is often throughout this 1 year period, it's refugees are looking to learn one of the official languages, look to take part in employment workshops, look to take part in, supporting their mental health and trauma needs, making sure that their family is settling and learning about the culture and Canadian society. And so taking, imposing that loan repayment so early on in the process often hinders the settlement programming that was set up by this very specific program. Not all refugees are able to fully take part in the program because they're worried about needing to start the repayments, and so are looking for other work or other ways how they can work in other ways that they can pay back on this program. So they're not able to fully commit and complete, for example, their English language learning. And so that impedes them in the future, looking in a future perspective of being able to get the jobs that will help them and their family thrive in Canada and not only survive. And so looking at it from a future perspective, we're doing a disservice to members of our community who are going to be contributing back to our community. However, they just need a little bit of support in the beginning so that they are then fully able to contribute to society. And Van City, which is a local credit union here in Vancouver, they did a research report at the start of the Syrian Refugee Initiative, and we're looking at the financial contributions that Syrian refugees who would arrive to BC, what they would provide to the economy. And it was looked over, so it was looked at the fact that approximately 2,500 Syrian refugees were expected to be arriving in BC in 2016. And it was projected that within the 20 years that they would be here in BC, that they would contribute over $500 million to the local BC economy. And so, and that would be looking at it through purchasing goods and services, contributing, having children who are going to be going through the education system and getting jobs, and being part of that, the community and that network. So it's important to not just look short term as somebody who has come to Canada who needs all this support and they're very vulnerable. Yes, they are. However, they are also very resilient individuals. Refugees are among some of the most determined, courageous individuals that I know. They have survived many different horrendous things in their past and have found a way how to survive and often stay together as that family unit and have come to Canada. And so I think it's for us as a society to be able to support them, to integrate into the society, allowing them to fully take part in the services that are created and designed specifically to assist them, is enabling them to better contribute to society. And in the end, you know, it'll benefit everyone in society.
Thank you, Sabrina. I'm just looking through the rest of the questions here. I think there are a lot of things that we can pick up on. So we were talking a little bit about misconceptions of refugees, or you were just saying just now. So what would you say are some of the misconceptions about ILP from the point of view of the Canadian public? What do you think is the best strategy for engaging the public to increase awareness on this issue? Maybe Olive can start? Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted. That's my fault.
Okay, no problem. I think the first thing to say is I don't think the public is at all aware of the travel loan program, or very few are. When I first started to talk about refugees and the findings of my own research, even colleagues who were engaged in research about newcomers and with newcomers were shocked when I mentioned travel loans. They had no idea. So I'm thinking, if you're a researcher and you're researching newcomers, including refugees, and you don't know about those travel loans, then how can we honestly believe that the public understands that either?
I've been working in anti-genocide activism for a long time, and yeah, I've never had an easier sell with the campaign than when you tell someone, you know, Canada is the only country in the world to charge interest on refugee loans.
Like, I tell my students that all the time. I actually teach a master's class on refugee health policies and practice, and I mean, the students are stunned, and I have students in that class from Maastricht too. So I can do a little bit. Just wanted to follow on with my colleague. One of the problems also with people dropping out of language classes early to take work on to pay that debt is they only have 1 year. Newcomers only have access to language for 1 year at no cost to them. Once they're beyond the year, they're out of pocket for that money, and it's not inexpensive. It's quite expensive when you have to do that. It's like $3 an hour, plus you've got to find the time to do it if you're working. I think there are good models in the world, like Denmark. Every refugee has access to 2 years of language training in Danish, and you can pick it up at any point in your life. So if you start out for 6 months and say you have to work, well, fine, but you can come back into the language program in 18 months, 2 years, and pick up where you left off. That's a long-term strategy, I think, that enables people to work to their full potential. And that matters to us in Canadian speak. I think the public need to also understand not just, here's these travel loans and what it does to the population who are burdened with the repayment of them, but also they need to understand we need newcomers, period, because our birth rate is 1.4. We're not replacing ourselves, and our economy is dependent on a workforce that's fully engaged and able to keep our industry moving forward. And without new people coming into the country, we're going to go into a downward spiral. So I think if we started to look at that, you know, the travel loans, not as a loan and a debt, but what can we do to invest in newcomers to help them settle and get ahead most productively? There are all sorts of consequences for children when they're raised in poverty, and none of this is a surprise to us in Canada. If you're interested at all in children and family, you know that we have unacceptably high levels of children living in poverty under the age of 5, and it stunts so many things. Brain development is reliant precisely on not just the social interactions within the family, but basic nutrition, you know, and I'm at a loss to understand why we would not, in this case, most vulnerable people, they didn't ask to come in here, we invited them in, and then we charge them these travel loans. It's just ludicrous. But it's also set in that broader context of child poverty. But it's easy. I mean, I've been focusing on families principally because those are the people that I'm mostly connected with and doing research with and for. But we have adults who are unaccompanied. We have people with disabilities who are unaccompanied and who struggle. And it's interesting because I've heard of a few people who talk about tough and all as things were maybe in Iraq or Africa and in Syria prior to coming. I mean, certainly not since the war started. People could make a living panhandling on the street, you know, selling small products and stuff. They can't do that easily in Canada. And so there's a limited option already for people with disabilities in terms of gainfully employed, you know, and earning a livable wage. And so if you're a newcomer and also someone with disabilities, that's even more difficult. And so there's so many layers to this. And I think our public needs to be aware and informed about travel loans. They need to be aware and informed about those levels of difficulty. And the fact that we need our newcomers to do well. We need everybody to do well. But these are very resilient people, as we've all said. They have survived enormous situations that we just can't imagine for the most part. Many of them are educated professionals, and we put them back to the lowest end of the income scale in minimum wage jobs. And I think we need to work smarter at finding ways to, if you will, engage in much more of a capacity development strategy, like where are people at? Where have they come from? And many of the Syrian refugees come from rural backgrounds. They may not have gone to school, many of them, and that's fine. They earned money on their own farm, on land they owned, or they worked in neighborhood, you know, in neighbor's land. And most of our refugee resettlement is urban. And so I think we need to have a better plan going forward. We really do. So I hope that sort of answers the question. So I think our public, first off, they need to know about travel loans. They need to know the consequences of repayment starting so early in that first year. Like but I don't even want to think about protecting the first year. I think we should aim for stop the travel loans, period. Just stop them, you know. We managed to do that for a few months, and I think we should go back and look at that again. You know, because we're bringing in. Sorry, I just also wanted to say before I forget, greater than 95% of refugees become Canadian citizens. Like they really do make a commitment to this country. Sorry, so that I'm done. So.
I'm just gonna write that down.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Olive. One of the things that we do at STAND to try to illustrate the kind of disparity or lack of connectedness between, or the lack of sense that it makes to be charging loans so quickly, that in most places in Canada, student loans are expected to be to begin repayment after 6 months. So it's quite a difference. Sabrina, do you want to address that question about public awareness?
So I think that the majority of individuals in the public are not aware of the transportation rehabilitation loan for. But however, I think that when it is addressed, it needs to be addressed and brought to the light in a way how that uplifts everyone. So I would not like to see it being addressed in the public as, you know, addressed as, yeah, of course, refugees, you know, they get certain supports, you know, they get more or less than other Canadians, and we're asking them to pay back the loans, which is a good thing. So it's a way how it's framed, and I can definitely see this subject being framed for not positive reasons. And so I think that, like you just mentioned, that the student loans for students, you know, I think that is something that students can connect and tie that together with the refugee travel loan, instead of saying, okay, you know, we're repaying student loans, refugees need to repay the travel loan. How can we uplift each other to have a conversation, a national conversation on debt and loans for everyone that's impeding our future ability to enter the workforce? Instead of looking at it from pitching one side against each other, how can we uplift everyone? And so that would be how I would like to see it addressed in society. And so far, what I've been, the conversations with Stand, that's the approach that I've been hearing that you guys have been taking, is let's look at it from the collective, and how can we, by addressing everything, how can we uplift and support each other?
And we certainly strive to do that. Going kind of onto that, you were saying earlier that treating this issue like it's a zero-sum game, that, you know, money that we take from money that we give to refugees is taken from other people, or same thing with jobs. You hear this kind of rhetoric a lot. We had a meeting recently with a member of parliament who explained that the way that the system kind of works is that the loans are paid out from a kind of pot, and that when refugees pay back those loans, it kind of replenishes the funds to fund more refugees. So when we talk about abolishing the loan or reducing the loan or taking away some provisions like interest, one of the kind of pieces of resistance that we get from people is that, isn't it better to help more refugees by making people pay a little bit more in comparison to helping fewer refugees with like 100% government assistance or something like that? What are your thoughts and reaction to that comment? An additive question, sorry.
I think that what needs to be clear first, before we even get into that question, is the various different streams how somebody could be coming to Canada as a refugee. Because there are various, so one of the streams is a government assisted refugee, and that's the refugee that we've been kind of mainly talking about, who comes, who majority of them have the travel loan and receive the resettlement assistance program for a year. There's also privately sponsored refugees who also do take the travel loan, not to the same extent. Percentage is less than compared to the government assisted refugees, but these are refugees who are sponsored by various different groups. So it could be sponsored by a church group, a group of 5, a different constituency group, and they come, and it is the responsibility of that sponsor group to support them financially for the first year. And then there is also the government, the blended visa officer referred, or BVOR program, which is a blend of two. So it's 6 months government support and 6 months private support. And this is often a stream that is used for the most vulnerable refugees that do arrive. The numbers are much less, and there hasn't been too much documentation or reports on the travel loan or anything for this group, as this is a relatively new program. I think it's been in existence for 2 to 3 years. I just need to double check that. And then there's also refugee claimants who arrive. And refugee claimants are individuals who arrive one of our borders, either land or airport or sea, and who come and make a claim either at the border or make a claim somewhere when they're within the country claiming refugee, their refugee claim. And so there's various, and so refugee claimants come on their own, and they receive the least support of all refugees because they do not qualify for even resettlement assistance program or any of the other supports that do exist. But going back to your question in terms of kind of adding it up to that zero-sum game, something is being taken away and something is being less, I think that's not the right approach. We're looking at we're looking at that they're not going to be these individuals who come are not going to be refugees. Like my colleague said, the majority become Canadian citizens, contribute to society, and so we want to increase the numbers that we receive, but we also want to make sure that the individuals who we do have here, that they are able to succeed and to integrate and to become part of Canadian society. So I don't like to see it as that sum-all game.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's great if we can frame the issue differently, like you were saying. Olive, do you want to comment?
Yes, just one thing that strikes me when I hear who came to Canada back in the late 60s and during the 70s, right up until the early 80s, they came in what I understand was termed a travel assistance program. So as long as you stayed in Canada for a set number of years and you were working and paying into the system, i.e. through taxation, etc., you were actually not having to pay anything back. But if you left the country within a shorter period of time, you actually had to pay that back. So we've had that history, and I think maybe that's the way to go, understanding that the vast majority of refugees will not be leaving early. They will be staying and becoming Canadian citizens. But the vast majority are working, and they are contributing. Their children certainly go through the system and tend to do really well. I think because parents will sacrifice for their child's future, and they want to secure that future in Canada because of what they've endured and come from. I think what's missing is really the refugee voice on the subject of travel loans. Like, I haven't seen too much of us asking newly arrived refugees as a cohort, you know, so what's their feeling about travel loans. I suspect most people, if there's no interest and it doesn't start that early and we give people a chance to find their feet before we ask for repayment, they may actually see that quite differently. But given how affluent our country is relative to the rest on the world stage, it just seems to me that this is a policy that could and perhaps should be changed. But I think understanding where the refugee voice would be on that matter might be an important thing to do. It just seems unseemly that we hardly allow people to catch a breath, if you will, before we expect that repayment to start. That's a concern. And they're adjusting to so many things in that early stage. Ideally, I'd like to see refugee loans stop altogether, but for reasons that have already been stated, the risk is then further creating further discord that's directed specifically at refugees. Because I think we've seen some of that. There was myths that they're getting free housing, that they're getting welfare and getting money more than Canadians. Absolute nonsense. They're not. They always get less than Canadians. The housing is at full cost, I understand, even on the Refugee Assistance Program. And then people have to qualify for social housing later. So this isn't something where refugees are benefiting over and above our local community at all. I think what has happened that, if you will, kind of supports that, and my colleague Sabrina, she mentioned the private sponsorship. We're seeing private sponsorship on a scale that we have never seen before. I would hope that that continues into the future, but that creates some imbalance as well, frankly, within the refugee community itself. and even from private sponsorship group to private sponsorship group. There's no set pattern, and we're learning more about that too as we go forward. The good news is in Canada, because I went to the Metropolis conference, and I urge anybody who's interested in this topic to attend both the CCR consultations, fall and spring, and also the Metropolis National Conference. What we heard there was, in fact, about the targeted programming, about the supports in place for private sponsorship, and about the dreams and aspirations of the program. But most importantly, what we heard was that really for the first time, the Government of Canada is creating, I mean, it's surprising to hear that we just started this, a very organized, comprehensive database that will track all refugees coming through, to look at their progress, to look at different indicators like housing, schooling, all of that. We actually haven't had that. We have small pockets of interest, small pockets of data. We have research studies, but they're limited in what they can do because they're funded to answer a specific question. So we're going to be in a better position in the future to determine the outcomes going forward. And I hope that we have a more systematic way to perhaps get a refugee voice, you know, a significant voice in terms of the business of travel loans. These are generally, like we said many times, resilient people. They're proud. They don't want to end up in bad light, if you will, as they're going to become Canadian citizens on the grand scale. And they do contribute significantly to this country. I think we saw some interesting showcases of people who came to Canada, North America, the UK, Germany as refugees back, you know, decades ago, and their children. And like Steve Jobs is probably the most famous. You know, and we've seen some examples of that, people who've attained significant prominence in different fields in our societies. And without refugee movements and supports, that limits all of us, frankly. And I think it's the right thing to do as well. But I understand not everyone will see that, you know, take my perspective on it. But like I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic for the future, you know.
Regarding the infrastructure necessary to oversee these loans, we found that in the research that we've been doing at STAN, that there are some big holes in the information that's available to the public or that is available, period. It makes it really hard from the advocacy perspective to make these arguments. So I'm hearing from both of you that there's some major infrastructure changes that have to be made on a pretty large scale. And then the issue of the privately sponsored refugees solves some problems in the short term, but maybe creates other problems in the long term. I was sitting next to a colleague the other day at a meeting, and they got an email blast that went out widely, asking if there was anyone who knew any Arabic interpreters in the Haida Gwaii region of BC up north, where a bunch of refugees had arrived, and there was literally no one who could communicate with them.
Wow.
So I can see how the way that government might be able to administer and address these kinds of issues, if the infrastructure is working properly, that could be riskier on the private scale. Sabrina, do you have any thoughts on that line?
So with the Serene initiative, the interest in the private sponsorship, it outgrew the anticipation of everyone. And so that's where I'm thinking that's where I'm seeing some of these growing pains of these programs now slowly emerging. In itself, it's a great concept, and it was until recently a very unique concept to around the world, where only Canada was one of the very few countries that even had a private sponsorship stream for refugees. So the concept of it, that private individuals could come together to support and assist refugees to come, would be is an immense move forward compared to other countries. And it was the numbers of private sponsorship groups were very small, and many, not all, but many groups that were sponsoring through, for example, their own ethnic faith group or their own faith community. However, with the Syrian initiative, the sponsor groups and the interest in sponsoring refugees grew immensely, and so the infrastructure to connect private sponsor groups with settlement organizations and settlement services that existed in communities wasn't there. Those linkages weren't there, just out of the sheer fact that this interest hadn't existed before. And so now that for many sponsor groups, they're coming towards their 1 year mark of sponsoring, and on this large scale that hasn't happened before. Now these little growing pains and these gaps are being noticed, and that's where my colleague was very toward that. That a database and data and different mechanisms are being created to track and better evaluate and support. So I think that overall that this is a really great program, and that this is one that has been a beacon for Canada on the international stage, and many countries have looked to see how they could replicate this program. And I know from my organization I've had many conversations just in terms of how the private sponsorship program, what are the benefits and the gaps and the challenges, and how a program like this could be replicated in other countries. So that is something that is of immense interest, and it's something where Canada is taking that lead on the world stage and moving forward. It's something where we are able to and can, take more leadership in terms of refugee resettlement.
Excellent. Olive, do you want to add anything?
No, just I would absolutely echo that. I think we're at a new juncture in terms of the interest. Almost everywhere I turn, somebody is part of a group of sponsoring Syrian refugee families. My hope is that it actually is sustained over time and extends beyond that. I think the government was surprised when there was such a protest from private sponsorship agreement holders back a few months ago, when they started to slow down. They reached the 25,000 target and started to slow down. And what had happened was many of the private sponsorship groups had property rented for families coming. They had organized supplies, etc., for families coming. And then here they were, no one was coming. And so they successfully lobbied government. I have to say, I think for the first in a long time, and even pre-Stephen Harper government, there wasn't that much of a listening ear at the federal level. But I think this is a government who seems to be more open to listening and to thinking from a humanistic perspective than we've had for quite some time. So they listened to that protest, and Minister McCallum agreed to continue processing so that some of the private sponsors could in fact receive and welcome the families that they had agreed to take. And so I was delighted to hear that. I know here in Hamilton, we have been expecting another push from October through to December of, I think it was 150 individuals. We're not going to have them all here by the end of December, but probably by early January. And so what we're finding ourselves in now, because I have to say, it was almost crisis management back in the spring, with the significant numbers coming in a very short space of time. We've learned a lot from that, from the growing pains that Sabrina talked about. We've had to train new people. We've had to redress some of the processing that we did before. And so we've learned a lot. And now I think we're into being able to do well with refugee resettlement. At least the processing in the early initial stages has been much improved. And I'm hoping that that's sustained over the longer haul. But it is a time for conversation going forward. How are we going to continue to do this and do it well? Because like I say, the vast majority will remain in Canada as citizens contributing to our society. And we need to try and do better, I think, however we do that, in terms of moving forward in that early year. And if the transportation loan could at the very least, be deferred to beyond that first year, that might be a good thing. If it could be interest-free, would be another. Ideally, none at all, but I'm also realistic. And I'm not sure, to be honest, because I've had conversations with refugees in my studies, refugee families. I'm not sure that they necessarily want to be seen as coming in, payment free, if you will. They certainly have their pride as well. But I think they do need a bit of space to be able to muster their resources again. It's a huge adjustment to coming to this society from where most refugees come from. Doesn't matter if it's Eastern Europe or Syria or Somalia or Cote d'Ivoire or Congo. It's very different here. It's a whole other system, and that takes a bit of settling in to find your feet. And so any or all of those, I think, if Stand could coordinate and push that forward. And I urge the public and anybody that's listening to check out the CCR website and your own website for information, because it's certainly there.
Thank you.
I think what's important to realize that on the world context and looking at the world stage, Canada is at a very unique situation. Mm. During the Syrian Refugee Initiative, we were watching it on TV. We had a government who took a leadership role and who said, yes, we're going to be taking in 25,000 government-assisted refugees and also private sponsorship groups. However, at the same time, while we in Canada, we were able to plan settlement organizations. The timelines were extremely tight and extremely short, and I know that many people worked over Christmas, including in the government. I know many individuals sacrificed their Christmas and their family time for this initiative. However, at the same time, it was planned, and it was something that, due to our geographical location and where we are in the world compared to where the situation is, we didn't have the mass streams that Europe was experiencing. And so for us here in Canada, it's quite different. At the same time, because we are in this privileged realm, and we are able to plan and have these things, it also gives us a lot of responsibility. And that's where these conversations need to occur, such as today, where we're looking at the refugee resettlement plans that we do have, the different streams that we have, and how can we continue to uphold our humanitarian commitment that we value as Canadians.
Definitely, I think what we're seeing in Canada, when people are talking in Greece about the refugee crisis, it's a very, very different conversation. I really like how you turn that around to Canadian responsibility based on our humanitarian objectives and values, that we have a greater responsibility because in a lot of ways we're less vulnerable as a country to the refugee and migration crisis that's happening in many places in the world. Olive, would you like to address?
Yes, just at the Metropolis Conference, there were delegations there back in May, I think it was, in Toronto. The delegations there are presenters from Germany and Australia. And it was interesting because the young man from Germany who was presenting said, you people in Canada are so fortunate because you're an island. It might be a huge island, but you're an island. So I think it's important for us to remind ourselves of that. Refugees can't walk across any distance to get to Canada. They have to fly or go through a port system, which means they're scrutinized, screened, and they've got documentation. And there's a limit to how many can come at one time, unlike the march through Europe. I've also heard some interesting reports. I'm not sure of the exact detail of it, but reports, for example, from Germany, where it has been said that the tax returns from working Syrians now it's larger than the cost of the resettlement effort for all of some very significant numbers of refugees that settled in Germany. What was also striking in the presentations I heard was just how much a small number of the public can do. Because this presentation talked about the large cities like Berlin, Munich, Dusseldorf, Stuttgart, and that, where there would be significant numbers, rather like ourselves, the large urban centers like Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, Hamilton, Winnipeg, etc., and the numbers that we all accept. But he talked about some of the small villages, and he named one specifically, and the name escapes me, close to a border in southern Germany, where it was a small village, largely rural community. The youth of the village were leaving to get jobs in the urban centers, and so they were thrilled to accept a number of refugee families who then started to help work the land and actually integrated really rapidly. And he talked about what that small village of 400 people were able to do for a pretty significant number, like it was 40 or up, of Syrian refugees coming in. And so at the end of the day, it's a people-to-people business, the business of resettlement. And some of it is systems and planning, and like Sabrina had said, we're in a very fortunate position. Really, refugee resettlement in Canada is very planned. It is not a surprise to us. And we've done enormously well, I think, given the pressures back in this time last year, you know, ramping up, getting ready. When I think of the hiring of new staff, the training, and then just the sheer numbers of people, because I think just about everybody in this city volunteered in some capacity, from the university, from healthcare, etc., to assist, for example, in health interviews, etc. And so you got to see that firsthand. It was quite overwhelming at times, but pretty quickly, once that initial surge was over, then that sort of settling into let's get organized and do this better. And so I think there's a lot that we've done that will be really beneficial in the long run, as long as we can now come back and ask the question about the travel loans. There's kind of a natural experiment in there, because there is a cohort who came in with no travel loans. And I'm hoping somebody's able to follow up with that cohort to see how are they doing relative to those with travel loans. But I think getting the refugee voice about the whole business of travel loans, the acceptability, would be useful. And I suspect that they absolutely do not have the issue with travel loans that many of us do, that they're relatively comfortable with the notion of paying it back. They just need time to get settled first. You know, and I think we could do that. And I think your example about student loans is really helpful, because my understanding is while you're still a student, you actually don't pay any interest. In fact, I don't think you have to pay anything until you're finished, right? And then you've got 6 months. Yeah, and then 6 months interest free. So I think that that's a good model, although, yeah, I think that would be a good model. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm delighted to see that the government continues to sustain refugees coming in terms of the numbers. And the other piece I think that we need to talk to about the public is the myth busting. So I hear and read, I just don't like the language I read in the press about, you know, rivers of refugees, floods, etc. And people saying the highest number ever. Well, you know, it's not the highest number ever. It is us meeting our target, which is 1% of the Canadian population. That's our annual target for migration, total numbers. And we're just about that 1% this year, even with these added numbers of Syrian refugees. So I think that's an important piece for people to bear in mind. But this country was settled at a time, huge improvement, huge strides forward as a nation state, when we actually had upwards of 1 million people coming at a time. This is back early in the 20th century, post-World War I, post-World War II. Those numbers were very significant with no infrastructure, really. So we're in a different place today. The communication options are very different. We have such a multicultural society. The availability for people who look like and sound like most newcomers coming in is so rich compared to what it was even 20 years ago. It's quite incredible. So I think we have opportunities here. I do.
And there are a million places I'd like to go from there, but we have to start wrapping things up. So one final question that I want to pose to the two of you, if you're so kind. So right now, Stand has a petition going. It's a parliamentary petition that's sponsored by the NDP Member of Parliament for Vancouver East, Jenny Kwan. What a parliamentary e-petition for our viewers means is that it's not a change.org petition or anything like that. If we get 500 signatures by January 28th, this will be tabled in the House of Commons, and we will receive a response from the government. So when we started looking at this issue at Stand, we were kind of surprised to see that there wasn't a lot of advocacy work. Like we expected that we would be able to jump onto other people's campaigns on this issue, and there are so many great resettlement and immigration organizations around Canada who are doing amazing work. But we weren't seeing that kind of focused advocacy, specifically advocacy efforts going on this issue necessarily. So we have the opportunity in January and February to make a big fuss about this issue in Ottawa and on the Hill. What advice do you have for us about building those relationships with the organizations that we need, of bringing refugee voices into the conversation at a much louder volume, both quantity and sound height? What advice can you give us in that regard to help make sure that this campaign has an impact?
I'll start then. I think the first thing is, if you're going to involve any refugees in signing anything, any document about shifting things, they need to be people who are not part of this current cohort, I would suggest, because I think people will be fearful of backlash, of being seen as ungrateful. So I think we want to maybe think about people who are well settled, well established, because that also is a powerful message. But I think first and foremost, the public are so oblivious of travel loans that I suspect there'd be quite a bit of shock. I know I was surprised at how far I had to push the presentations that I did early on when I did my PhD work, and I'm talking about 2007. People in the business of research with newcomers had no idea, and I actually got challenged on that. I couldn't believe it, and I thought, well, you know, I asked and I heard, and I was surprised, and I validated it. And aside from a small number of settlement staff, no one else, or very few people that I encountered, knew anything about it. So I think the biggest challenge of all is getting the information out to an audience who are going to be willing to sign. I think involving refugees who are quite well established now would be good. I think certainly the settlement sector itself would be, I think, seen as, well, that's kind of their business and they're going to want to sign that. But I think the private sponsorship network would be an option, because they are certainly people who are at least, you know, they're working, they're well settled, they have an ability to leverage support to bring in refugee families, they're interested in their well-being, and for many of them, they had very little idea of the whole push for resettlement in terms of, you know, access to housing, language, etc. And I think many of them are glad that they're in quite a group, because they've been a bit overwhelmed at the challenges for resettlement. And quite a number had no idea about travel loans before. And the number in the CCR website, I just checked there, 94% of government-assisted refugees have travel loans. 88% of private sponsored refugees. And these are not current numbers. These are back 2012, 2013, but still a relatively high number who had travel loans. And I think for some of the private sponsorship groups, they actually raised funds to cover the travel loan, to get it out of the way. And so I think that that's a group who would be knowledgeable, articulate. The vast majority that I know of are through church groups or academic groups, or, you know, community groups, and they by and large are professionals, and I think they would be willing to sign, and I think they might feel quite secure in doing that, and it'd be an informed voice. I do. Sorry, Sabrina.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Sabrina?
So yeah, just tapping into what my colleague said, yes, I totally agree with making sure that if you are discussing this and involving refugees, that you make sure that it's done ethically and responsibly and respecting the situation that they're currently in. And I think that it's something that, like I mentioned earlier, that we need to bring this up in the conversation so that it also doesn't get positioned as refugees versus, that
Yes.
we're a way how we can uplift everyone. I know that I've brought in this conversation about refugee loans before, and I got to hear, well, what about these groups of individuals, or what about this, And I'm like, yes, those are all very valid points, and we need to find a way how we can bring them and tie them all together and bring it up and uplift and support everyone. And I think tying it back to this value that we have as Canadians, and where we like to see and ourselves viewed in the world as being open and welcoming and supporting immigrants. I think that this is a way how we can get individuals to practically demonstrate it, and also really through correct education. So just making sure that the information that goes out, it's digestible and it's understandable for everyone, and it's not pitching one community versus the other, but that it's also accurate. Data is very, very good, important. And like my colleague said, the Canadian Council for Refugees, CCR, they do tremendous work, and on their website example, they do have like myths. They're trying to bust a couple myths that do exist, that come up when it comes into the conversation of refugees. And so I think just addressing those and looking at it from that perspective, and working with sponsorship networks and other networks that are existing, it would be very beneficial. At the same time, I do recognize that for many, fatigue has set in as well. I do recognize that for many, particularly individuals working within the settlement or within the sponsorship group, that for many, it's been a very challenging year, and I commend them and want to thank them for all the work that they have done, and all the hours and dedication that they have. I know that settlement workers who are supposed to work 35 hours a week have been working 50 hours a week, and 35 of those were paid, and the rest they were volunteer hours. So I do want to commend and recognize and thank them for all the work that they have been doing. At the same time, involving them in this campaign would be very beneficial. Just understanding their time limitations and kind of their current fatigue and the situation that they're going into, expecting more arrivals to come before the year end, is just to be aware and to balance that.
Thank you. So we have about oh, getting an echo now. We're very much going to make our 500 signature threshold for January, February. We definitely want to make it to Ottawa with a lot more numbers on that petition to show the government that there is support for reform of the way that things are being done right now. And I want to direct everyone to AMSSA. Stumbled over the acronym there, AMSSA. Please take a look and see what great work they're doing and how you can support them. Please do go to standcanada.org and sign our petition and share it within your networks. If anyone is interested in getting in touch with us more, you can definitely reach us at standwithus@standcanada.org. And just want to wrap maybe with a closing statement that as an anti-genocide organization, paying attention to refugees and trying to take care of refugees and extend a hand of help to them is central to genocide prevention and intervention in some of the most unproblematic ways that are available. So we as are committed to this, and we invite everybody to join us and think about how we can really help people in a concrete way here in Canada. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to end the broadcast.